Do you have like a visceral reaction when you touch like clay or like what
Oh yeah, every time. I mean, I don't know how to describe it. It's just, how would I describe? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's my art material. It's just kind of what I was put on this planet to do, is interact with these materials and help other people do that too. When I started, there wasn't really like a building industry, a bio-based. I mean, still, we're at the very beginning of developing a bio-based building industry, but there was literally nothing except the people who were DIY, hands-on. Very few contractors who were practicing these building techniques. And so as I mentioned, I learned at the end of a dirt road with no power tools. Really sort of like, how do you start from the ground up and from the raw materials. Really cool thing about working with clays straight out of the ground is that they're endlessly variable and interesting, and you get different colors and different compositions, and so they really require attention in the right way to work with them well, but they never become uninteresting. Like, there's always something new to learn about them, and they're both very simple in terms of the basics of working with them, and really, really complex in terms of like optimized performance. And so, I mean, you could spend a lifetime just studying clays for construction. Pretty quickly I started teaching, because a lot of people taught as much as they built, just because there was a big demand, and it didn't take much to know more than someone who had never done it, just because there was literally such a small community of people practicing and relearning the skills. And so that helped me just be connected to a bigger community pretty quickly, and also just got me interested in the process of teaching natural building. Really made me aware of some of its deeper impacts on people in a good way. And I still feel that a lot of what I do is just help the materials speak for themselves and have the impacts that they have on people. So I got really interested in taking the values and the implications of natural building out of the dirt road context and into the urban fabric, or like, more mainstream thinking about building, and pretty much have been on that path ever since. After doing mostly hands-on work for about 10 years, you start to realize how much work still needed to happen to be able to scale these techniques into a wider context. And really what I'm best at, like, I'm really a materials person. I love messing with the materials. I love, helping other people understand the materials. And early on in the movement, you couldn't specialize. You had to and nor did I really want to. I was really interested in like the whole building and like how to do everything, as you are when you're young. But as the movement grew and as I got older, I liked the idea of specializing more, and it became more possible to specialize. And so increasingly, I collaborate with engineers, architects, as a materials specialist who has a bunch of hands-on experience. Of the natural materials that we use most often, clay is the one where you have to know the most about assessing it, and also I think it stops people from using it a lot, because that can feel intimidating, and you can do it wrong. There's some clays work for some things, and other clays work for other things, and some clays work for most things, but they're not consistent. But what's wonderful about earthen architecture is clay exists that will be useful for something almost everywhere in the world. Like, there's a more diversity of earthen building techniques than maybe any other thing, because everybody figured out that you could use this stuff to stick buildings together. But then how to do it depends entirely on your climate and your geology and your cultural forces and like many, many other things. And so there's this incredible diversity of earthen building traditions worldwide that are being lost, but also relearned at the same time. Right after World War II, building became industrialized almost everywhere, and so masonry blocks or stick frame construction or concrete became kind of ubiquitous, even in places in the world where they didn't necessarily make a lot of sense. because they were perceived as modern building. And many, many techniques were lost or were almost lost. And then people began to realize, oh, right, then climate change became a reality, and limitations on fossil fuels and all sorts of other, the sort of interweave of problems that natural materials address became more and more and more apparent. Now we're supply chain disruption, so every time we go through another bit of, at least temporary breakdown, maybe longer term breakdown in systems that we thought were normal, you see more and more why these older, more traditional building systems are really resilient and, have a lot of values that can be hidden when everything is industrialized, and it also doesn't mean we can't industrialize earthen building to a greater degree. Like there's a lot of room to grow there that we just haven't really tackled because the values weren't there. So we're kind of at the beginning of that growth curve. But assessing your clays is the foundation of all of that. And so how do you do that? The process for beginning to assess a soil for construction is pretty consistent. There is an organic layer to soil, and so when you're assessing for clay, you want to go below that. And also, often you get more clay as you go deeper. Clays often, if they're sticky, will look like clumps when you dig them out of the ground dry. And so visual markers of clay, obviously it's cracked when it's dry. Not all clays will do this, but it's one good way to be like, oh, this might be worth testing. They will often have classic earth tones in them because clay minerals like to bind to mineral oxides. So reddish colors or yellowish colors, usually a good indicator. And then stickiness is the main one. And for a lot of installs, all you really need to know is how sticky the clay is and what it does when it dries. And so very, very baseline clay assessment, and then you can get way more sophisticated from there depending on what you need. So what I will do if I'm assessing a site clay for use in building is that I'll just look at it first. That tells you a lot. And then I will typically just find a way to hydrate it. You begin to work the clay, the water into the clay with your hands, and it begins to hydrate. When I talk about clay, earthen builders and bio-based materials people have a bad habit of referring to clay and clay soil interchangeably. When I talk about clay, what I really mean is a clay soil. So it's a mineral subsoil with a clay content that makes it suitable for building. Like even from this, I can tell that it's starting to, there's enough stickiness here that if I didn't know this clay, I could say, oh, this is probably worth making samples out of and investigating further. If you're looking at a building site or if you're thinking about, somebody else's clay that might be available, all you really need to do is go over there with a bottle of water and just start to hydrate it in your hands, and you'll learn quite a lot. And then from there, what I will do is take a bigger bucket of it and soak it if it feels like that's going to be the easier way to work with the clay. And then I'll start making blocks out of it. This would be a pretty good example of just how to test the material. I'm like, well, does it work? What happens when you mix it with the ingredients that you'd put into adobe and dry it? Does it hold together? Does it break? Is it crumbly? Is it impossible to work with? Like, there are clays that are so sticky that you do not want to spend your time with them because they're so hard to work with. But so many of the different natural building techniques that employ a lot of clay have the same ingredients in them. So if you just make blocks with some sand and some straw, you'll get a lot of really good baseline information. And then just to give you another example of like a different kind of clay, this is kind of the opposite of the clay spectrum from my site soil. It's a material, we just call it Nuns Canyon, but it's named for a stone quarry that it comes from. And this is a good example of regional clay sourcing. These are called quarry fines. And it's all the little stuff that gets washed out of all the grades of stone that they sell and that they don't have a use for. And so it's a mix, it's an unusual color for California, this peachy color. And it's a really interesting mix of relatively fine angular sand, which is really nice, and a lot of fines, fine particles, some of which is silt and a lot of which is clay. And it's easy to work with, it soaks really easily, and so it's kind of like ready mix for a lot of earthen building techniques depending on what you want to do with it. They typically want to get rid of it, so you could often get 20 yards of it for the price of delivery because they don't sell the material. And so it's one good way to, when you're looking for clay soils and you don't have like an immediate source, quarries can be a good place to look. I do have an academic background. I was really one of those like brainy dorky types. So everybody was like, yeah, I should go off to school and like go to grad school and go teach something obscure, which I could very well have done, but realized I would have lost my mind if I had to sit, like my idea of hell when I was in my early 20s was an office. So I spent my early 20s, sort of looking around I was also very fortunate to have a family that was like, no, go find your life calling. Like, yeah, that worries us a little bit that you're going to go off on some like strange left tangent, but go figure out what you need to do. And so I spent a couple years doing wilderness work and trail work in my early 20s, and then was like, somebody gave me a book on straw bale building, I think I mentioned, and I was like, well, I need to just kind of go find out about that. Like, what is that about? And had the experience of going through my first week-long class and being like, oh, this is my life's calling. I don't even know what that means, but helping these things come into the world is how I want to spend my life. And so I called my parents. It's like, I found my life's calling. I was 24, 25, something like that. And they were like, oh my God, we should have known, and sent me this picture, which is me lying in a clay puddle, in a dirt road, in the little town of Hogeye, Arkansas, which is where I spent my first couple years, and then we moved into town. Apparently I spent my entire childhood digging clay out of riverbanks in the Ozark Mountains and trying to figure out what to do with it. So it's been a lifelong, just like one of those things, just love of the materials. And, I like pottery clay, but like what I really like is the stuff that comes out of the ground. Why? Just how I was born. I don't know. We're about to make a very basic clay plaster using the clay from my site, which is a 1/4 acre in a semi-urban part of the East Bay in California. And it comes out of the ground looking like this if it's dry, or basically crazy sticky mess when it's wet. And so I tend to soak it before I do anything with it. But this is going to be a very a basic rough clay mix, meaning that it's a bottom coat, not a finish coat. And it uses the 3 ingredients that go into pretty much every natural building mix, or many of them. Here's my clay in a soaked and screened state, which is how we're going to use it in the plaster. We just put it through a medium grade metal screen. This is plaster sand, and this is shredded rice straw that's about 1 inch long or a bit shorter. There's a mix of fiber sizes in there. And these are the 3 classic ingredients for all sorts of earthen wall systems, plasters, floors, and you just mix them in different proportions and in different grades. Like if you're doing an earthen floor, I could have used a coarser screen for this because you don't mind some chunks. If I'm doing a finished plaster, it's going to be a finer screen. So we're starting with the screened clay. Another fun thing about clays is that they don't set chemically, they just dry. And so you can make mixes way in advance of when you need them. So this project is really fun to work on because it's basically just a conventional stick frame structure that integrates really well with a bunch of different natural building techniques. Because of the use I want of this building, we're using like 6 techniques to add aesthetic appeal, but also performance to what was a tool shed. So we're going to work on this wall with a couple of different types of clay plaster. And this may look like cement, but this is actually what my site clay looks like when it dries. It's a very grayish clay, but I do like to point that out because some people look at it and they're like, why is there concrete on your wall? It's not, it's a gray clay. And we're about to apply a base coat plaster on this wall system, which is called earthen plaster. This is really fun because it is a renewed technique that is ancient and has a bunch of other ancient relatives, and also has a history in the Bay Area in a different format. The older form of earthen plaster, this specific technique, is typically used with lime plaster, and it is how all of the older wood frame houses were built in the Bay Area. And so if you go do remodeling around here, typically you're cutting into a earthen plaster wall. And so they're a little different. The plaster's really thin. I made my own lath here because I like the thicker lath, and also I'm building this wall out. I love doing clay plaster on lath, partly just because I love the clays, but partly because lime plaster, which is used a lot in natural building, has a really high carbon footprint. whereas clay really does not. Clay is a few percentage points of the carbon footprint of lime, because lime, the binder, is basically cooked limestone that has become reactive. And when you combine it with water, it basically turns back into limestone. But the cooking process requires a lot of energy. And so lime, similar to concrete, for the same reason, has a very high carbon footprint because of the energy required to make it. And clay, especially in an interior application, will do pretty much anything you need lime to do. And the only energy required for the clay is to dig it out of the ground, maybe transport it to some degree if you're not digging it out of your yard, which most people aren't, and some refining, which is usually screening and maybe crushing. And so the energy required to get clay to a state where you can build with it is very, very, very low. I mentioned that this is being renewed, this technique, and it's mostly being renewed as a clay on lath technique by a lot of people in my community. And the fun thing about the natural building community, the bio-based building community, is that it's endlessly innovating. Because there's so much space to continue to adapt these techniques to the modern day. I'll do the rough build out here because I want to start building this thickness out to even up this whole wall. So it's good to get the first coat in. I'd love to talk about natural and bio-based building as the cutting edge of a 10,000-year-old tradition, because it's built upon these very, very, very old ways of making housing. But they, as living traditions always do, they need updating. And we do need them to perform as well as industrial materials as much as possible, for people to really be able to adopt them. And in areas where they don't, help people understand why, so clay tends to be a softer material than concrete, but concrete has orders of magnitude bigger impact than clay. And so, if you just understand why you're making that choice, then, people are often, fine with the differences in material. So in here, I've been installing the rigid hemp board as the plaster substrate. You could be using sheetrock here. You could make a sheetrock wall, prime it for plaster, and then plaster it. I'm using hemp board because I prefer hemp to sheetrock for lots of reasons. I like these wall systems because the natural component doesn't require you to do a whole different framing system. And so you're just swapping directly out for one particular component of the wall assembly, in this case sheetrock. This is a relatively new approach to plastering because it's relatively recent that we have these rigid plant-based fiber boards, but we haven't really had that as an option as a substrate before. And so, a lot of people in my field are kind of continuously innovating. That's one thing that I've loved, especially about the, what I call open source building, which is all of these ancient techniques that we've all sort of collectively been relearning. And so there's this wonderful, robust community of people who are keeping these practices alive and building upon them, and they're not proprietary products. So they're building systems that use readily available materials, and so you can't patent, nobody owns them. And what you end up with there, which is really neat, is this incredibly robust framework for product development. So they're not actually in conflict with each other. And they're actually complementary because there are uses in buildings that we need products for that these traditional building techniques don't work very well for, but products can help fill that gap.
Always sure, knocking on the door, one time, knocking on the door. Knock, knock. Hello, something real.
Industrial building, which of course is a very vague term, and I don't, it also covers so much territory that it's not useful to make it a good or a bad thing. Obviously, industrialized methods have, contributed hugely to our lives. But overly industrialized building, where you have these huge supply chains and a lot of hidden energy costs, a lot of toxic materials, and individuals don't have a lot of control over that. That approach to building can create as many problems as it solves. And what I really love about these techniques, in their very simplest form, they may or may not work for all modern contexts, but they offer this incredible reservoir of potential solutions that we haven't even come up with yet, because I think you can bring a lot of the best of industrialized processes and thinking to these materials and continue to innovate, but keep all of their strengths, and so one way I like to try to capture their superpower in terms of solutions is a Venn diagram that I use a lot when I give presentations. And actually one of my favorite policy people that I work with a lot brought this to my attention. She said, yeah, if you're a policy person working with the built environment, you're typically thinking about 5 buckets of problems that you're trying to solve. Climate change, and reducing carbon emissions, building health and building occupancy health, circular economy, so reducing waste, affordability and equity, just access to housing, and regional resilience. And of course there are others, but these are just the 5 very common areas that people are always trying to address. And while there are a lot of materials and processes from conventional building, all types of building that could address 1 or 2 of those, the superpower of bio-based materials is that they can frequently address all 5 at the same time. And so it's a form of leverage that we don't usually think about. So when you have a polycrisis is the way some people talk about these sort of webs of problems that we have now. I like to characterize bio-based materials as a poly solution. This wall system is called light straw clay, which is kind of a goofy name because it's a direct translation from German, Leichtlehm. And it's a name for one of the many infill wall systems that they put in those old timber frames. So if you think of like a storybook house from Germany with the big timbers and the cross pieces and the walls, and then there were just like panels in between the timbers, that was often infilled with something kind of like this. This is the modernized version. But it's really fun to show people because people, when they think of straw construction, like site built, they think of just baled straw, which has become kind of the most common residential form of straw construction in the States. But light straw clay is another form where you control the wall thickness. And so it's really good for working with existing frames or where you don't want a really thick wall. It's a versatile technique. Once you make your clay slip, then you take chunks of straw. So straw tends to come out of the bale in flakes. I just have a loose pile because I was already working with it. But you pull the straw apart so it's loose. And then you basically just pour clay slip over the straw and toss it like a salad. So you can imagine how a big auger tumbling straw and clay together would give you the same thing, which is how people scale up this mixing process. So light straw clay requires a frame to infill. It can't be freestanding. Other types of straw construction, especially bales, some people have used load-bearing forms of construction where you can stack up the bales and they're holding the roof up, which is great, although you tend to have a lot of design limitations when you do that. So what we're going to do is form up a component of both sides of the wall and then tamp the straw in that formwork and then move the formwork up. And you're not trying to over compact the straw. I'm doing a relatively dense version of this, but when I'm doing the lightest weight version, you just do a quick tamping round. It's more like getting the straw to settle into the form, and that's all you really need. And press out any big air gaps, where the mix might be just stuck. I think one thing I really love about a lot of the kind of first principles or very simplest forms of natural building is that they're mostly pretty forgiving. And until they aren't in just some very specific ways. Like one way to screw this up is to do this and then leave the formwork on because then the walls will mildew. But it's not too bad. So places where it can be hard to tamp, you can get these gappy spots in light straw clay walls and they're pretty easy to fill with plaster or a slightly stickier mix of clay and straw like that. In the context of talking about living traditions and straw building, I'm also I'm a co-founder of a startup developing a panelized straw wall system, a prefabricated straw wall system insulated with a straw-based matrix that I'm developing. I'm the materials person for the startup. But this basically is a direct descendant of this wall system. And so it's so fun to be both helping other products get more visibility and really be a part of understanding how prefabrication and product development is very much in line with, this ancient tradition that we practice. The culture of the people who learn natural building to begin with, were really ambivalent about scaling. They were like, we're not sure if that's what needs to happen with these things. I think it's a pretty interesting question, actually. Now I think the conversation we should focus on is supply chains, and the reality and the real power now of regional economies. Like, you can totally recreate a regional building economy. Doesn't mean you can't use things from further away, but I think people don't realize how achievable that is. And I think we're at a political moment, and also a moment in climate change where that's going to start making a lot of sense to a lot of people. And so that's my interest, is kind of there. Like, how do we get that conversation started? Because this is the right way to think about bio-based building. It is regional, both for materials, but also just for climate and microclimate considerations. And so it's the next step in really developing the technical aspects of natural and bio-based building, I think. I'm making an Adobe built-in, so this will be a bench. Doing this for two reasons. One, I feel like there's considerable unexplored territory for just using Adobe in interesting interior non-structural applications. Adobe and cob together, so Adobe is sun-dried blocks of clay, and cob is just the same mix, basically, but shaped in place. But when you're doing interior work, Adobe is really nice just because cob would take forever to dry in an interior. And also you can make very, very lightweight Adobe blocks. These are like medium weight. So the way I'm going to do this one, it's going to have two columns of Adobe on the sides to complete the bench. These Adobes will get installed over the arch form, and then the form itself gets pulled out, and then I'll just flatten the top of the arch to make the bench. One thing I love about the very, very grassroots form of natural building is that you are face to face with your impact. Like, you're digging a hole in the ground and getting your clay out. You're not quite face to face with your straw impact, but you're buying from a local farmer. So you're, I like to say that natural building supply chains are very short and very transparent. And so you both have to think about the impact, but you also are able to make all sorts of positive choices that you simply can't make when you're sourcing sheetrock. With this like global, completely opaque supply chain that you don't have access to, right? When straw building was really very niche here, it wasn't like getting straw wasn't a problem. But as we start to have more straw buildings, and as we start to have droughts, suddenly you have to start understanding bigger patterns of rice growing and or wheat growing, or who else grows grains that are straw producing. And so one thing we're doing through CASBA is actually just supply chain mapping and coming to understand what farmers are dealing with, and a hidden superpower of the plant-based materials is that the supply chain is very short and it's mostly farmers, and so there you can make a lot of choices around what kind of land management you support by where you source your straw and understanding a lot about agricultural ecosystems. And so that's a big interest of mine, because I feel like that's one fabulous way to scale the values of natural building. So I'm making my base layer of my earthen floor mix, and you can do earthen floors in various ways. I like to do a subfloor of earth and then a finished floor on top, and all of that goes on top of compacted gravel, or it could be a slab. But there's other ways to do it. You don't have to do 2 layers. It's just the way I was taught, so I usually do it that way. And they tend to be relatively dense because it tends to be yet another variant of the same materials, clay and some kind of aggregate and fiber. So they're not really very insulating. But if you modify the mix, you can make a more insulating subfloor, which is what I'm playing around with here. So what I'm doing is, instead of putting sand or gravel in the base mix, I'm using perlite, which is basically a very lightweight porous mineral material. But when you put it in a clay matrix, it does fine, and of course it's going to be more dense than the perlite by itself. So that's what I'm doing for this floor. So it's clay, perlite, and chopped straw is my base layer for my earthen floor. You don't actually want a smooth texture on a base coat floor, because you want the finish coat to have tooth to grab onto. And people pour earthen floors on top of slabs. They pour them on top of wood subfloors. They're very versatile. They do require a relatively long curing time, although that's one thing that we're kind of working on modifying, just with the varying some of the sealants that we use, or like how the sealants are mixed together. But there's some natural oils coming on the market now that are just have non-toxic dryers in them that allow you to harden the floor a lot faster. There are so many facets to helping these materials scale that your attention can get really fragmented, because you're kind of trying to build several pieces of a world all at once, you know. So you're trying to develop supply chains, and you're trying to develop standards, and you're trying to do like chemical testing on clays, and it's like all of it has to come together to make an industry. And so we're at one of those tipping points, and I do need to keep my hands in the materials, and so I feel like I have to kind of fight for that a little bit right now, just because a lot of my work in the world is more like enabling things to happen, and also be able to keep grounded in the practices themselves, which is why I do any of this. So I have to keep recentering too, and that's why I keep recentering on just the hands-on practice, because I love all the bigger implications, but you can get lost in them. Like a phrase I love, one of my favorite collaborators these days, who's actually a policy person, says buildings are embodied culture. And I really feel like we've kind of forgotten what buildings are for in a lot of ways. Like there's so much more to them than just being comfortable and pretty, and like a good investment. And I also feel that these materials carry all of that in a really wonderful way. And earthen building and natural building also really is community building. Like it's meant to be built in community. It doesn't have to be done that way, but it lends itself to it, and so retaining that piece, and helping people stay connected to the feeling of being able to create your own shelter, even if you don't do it, like obviously nobody's gonna go build mud skyscrapers, though they do exist in Yemen. All right, so this plaster's starting to stiffen up, and so I'm getting to the point where I need to be both applying and also using a wet trowel in a minute to come and start doing the finer shaping on this. And so what generally works well is to get a lot of pretty flat material up as quickly as you can, and then go back. But you're always kind of monitoring how it feels and how it's drying. I'm wetting the wall down quite a lot, which you do anyway with clay plasters, but I mentioned that different clays are different in mineralogy, and there's something in this base clay, the Nuns Canyon quarry finds, that dries really, really, really fast. And so one thing we've been dealing with in this plaster install is staying ahead of the plaster hardening as you do the finish work, and so making sure that your substrate, when you work on top of it, is damp really helps that process. It's been really interesting to work with Nuns Canyon quarry finds in that capacity, because it does seem to have a unique ability to harden really fast. So again, one of these days I'm writing a clay mineralogy book. You realize that you can have very little and make a building. Like you can make a building with a shovel and a few cutting implements, and and so especially in times of upheaval, and we're gonna have more, unfortunately, with climate change, like having the baseline of real simplicity adds a feeling of stability to life that might be hard to retain, otherwise.